the goal behind vesting is to protect the company and to protect the other founders or stockholders who stick around.
Hey, this is Aaron Price, and welcome to another episode where today we are talking about equity, entity formation, and co-founder relationships. Really excited to have Jared Sorin, a partner at McCarter English, longtime supporter of the New Jersey Tech Council and TechUnited New Jersey. Jared, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So from where, we're in our new studio in Jersey City. This is a real background. Where are you joining us from?
I am remote from my house here in Millstone, New Jersey. Starting to get back into the office slowly but surely, but for now, still mostly remote.
Well, hopefully sooner than later, we'll be able to be together in person as we were at Propelify. So let's talk about common mistakes that founders make in the early stage. We've talked before on the Propelify stage about some of those mistakes. I want to reiterate some of those and talk about a few new issues there. But let's start with co-founder relationships. It can be a testy thing. What are some of the issues that you see arise when it comes to having a co-founder?
Yeah, the great question. First and foremost, it's equity allocation being, I think, the primary issue that we see with early stage founders. Understanding what the right equity allocation should be between and among the co-founders, and making sure that the people who are necessary to continue to grow that business are in it for the long haul and will be there because they have incentives to stick around. And so generally speaking, we do that in the early stages through vesting schedules, which we can talk about.
Well, let's jump in. So for one is, I think there's a lot of kumbaya in the beginning, and people are like, great, let's do this, we'll be 50-50. And I think often people forget about vesting. So let's talk first about is there an approach, and not just an approach, but can you come up with sort of a template that allows people to point to a structure versus like, I think I should get 90 and you should get 10 or whatever else, but a structure they can use to come up with equity allocation? Yeah,
it's a great question. You mentioned 50-50. So often we have founders come to us saying we should have equal ownership of this company. And very often that's not the right choice. It's not usually so evenly split that the relative contributions are exactly the same. And so while there's no like perfect formula and it's a little bit more art than science, you need to think about what are the relative contributions of each person. That's not only time, that's money, that is other resources. What is the importance of each person to the growth and success of this company? And you're right that it is often a difficult conversation to have among the co-founders, but it's really important to have it upfront and try to get it as close to right as possible, because it's harder to unwind and undo later on. And so we want to try to get it right the first time when you're forming the company.
And so when it comes to, do you think 50-50 is actually generally a bad place to land? Does it mean they may not have gone through the exercise, or could it actually be 50-50, but it needs to be deliberate?
It certainly can be 50-50, but you're right. It needs to be deliberate. I would say more often than not, 50-50 is not the right choice. But of course, there are circumstances where it does make sense. And so, if you're doing the analysis and understanding the relative value of each of the founders, certainly can land on 50-50. There are things that you should think about, though, if you do ultimately believe that it is 50-50. And one of the big issues with that is a risk of deadlock, right? So at the stockholder level, you vote based on your relative ownership of the company. So if there's a vote that requires stockholder consent and you own the company 50-50, you can't get a majority if you disagree. And so you run the risk of deadlock. And so that's an important factor to be thinking about. At the board level, there are votes that are done at the board level that are not necessarily stockholder votes, but the importance of size of the board and composition of the board are a factor here as well. If the two founders are on the board, it doesn't matter what their relative ownership of the company is. At the board level, generally speaking, it's one person, one vote. And so if you have an even number of directors, you run the risk of deadlock at the board level as well. So it's something that when we form a new company, we generally suggest having an odd number of board members. And to the extent that it makes sense, not necessarily a 50-50 ownership of the equity.
Do you think that it's appropriate, whether, let's talk about pre-funding, or maybe in the seed stage, if there are two co-founders or three, do you believe it's appropriate for both or all three to have board seats? And how might one navigate that if the answer is no?
Well, so the short answer is yes, it's appropriate, assuming that everybody understands the risks, right? That there is a risk of deadlock. Now, the board serves at the pleasure of the stockholders. So if the stockholders do not have 50-50 ownership or direct split down the middle, then the stockholders can always change the size or composition of the board later if it becomes an issue. But I've seen situations where two co-founders start a company, both on the board, 50-50 ownership, and then they are stuck when they can't agree.
Yeah. So let's get to vesting, right? First, explain to people what vesting means and why it's so important, especially for in the very early stages of formation.
Sure. Vesting is effectively earning your shares. Generally speaking, there will be a vesting schedule that is time-based or milestone-based. I generally suggest time-based vesting because milestones are inherently ambiguous. And the idea here is that you need the team to be incentivized to stick around, right? And when you bring on investors, they're going to want to know that the people who are critical to the success of this company are in this for the long haul, right? It takes a long time for a startup to grow and be successful under normal circumstances. And so you want to know that the team that they're betting on are here for the foreseeable future. So a typical vesting schedule in today's market is 4 years. There'll be a 1-year cliff, and then the remainder will vest in 36 roughly equal monthly installments. So nothing vests for the first year. On the 1-year anniversary, 25% of the shares will vest. And then thereafter, the remainder will vest in roughly equal installments. When we talk about vesting for founders, we actually are really talking about reverse vesting, where the founders own the shares on grant, but the company retains the right, but not the obligation, to repurchase those shares if for whatever reason the founder or service provider stops providing services to the company. That's important from a tax perspective so that they buy their shares at the nominal price. Right? When we're forming a company, we're setting the fair market value per share at something like 0.00001 cents per share. So from the founder's perspective, it's best to receive those shares at that time when they're worth nominal value, and therefore the tax liability associated with that will be truly negligible. Important note to file an 83B election if you receive your shares pursuant to a restriction so that you can benefit from that early nominal value. So
a few things I want to lean in there. We're going to come back to 83B, but I want to talk about the practical implication of the vesting schedule you just set out. I've been in this scenario. I had a co-founder. We actually did 50-50. We didn't quite know what we were doing. It was one of the first companies I started. He decided it wasn't for him, and so and I think this is the issue that comes up. He decided to leave. Miraculously, we're still actually very close friends. But now my ability to go recruit someone else with his 50% stake is problematic. And so we negotiated. Sure. We understood this issue. He was, I would call it, generous and understanding, and did release a bunch of his shares. But that could have tremendously backfired, and that's exactly what you're trying to protect against.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are many reasons why a founder would leave a company, not necessarily bad reasons, right? So the goal behind vesting is to protect the company and to protect the other founders or stockholders who stick around. And in your hypothetical, right, in your situation, you were lucky that he was a good actor and he was, generous in relinquishing shares because he didn't have to contractually. And so when we form this company to protect all of the other founders, we suggest that each founder take his or her shares pursuant to this risk of forfeiture.
Yeah, which I think makes sense.
And if failure to do so can have a real problem, like as you were alluding to, right? Now you were left. Let's say he didn't, give up on any of his shares. Now you'd be left holding only 50% of the company, but running the company alone. Presumably, you'd want to bring on someone else to fill the shoes of your co-founder, but you'll suffer added dilution as a result of needing to equitize that third person. So it has negative implications to the company, to the team that sticks around, and it makes it harder to recruit.
Not to mention, I think when you go for the fundraise, if you have that kind of scenario, it also doesn't make you look as professionalized as you want to be. There's sort of this, just having the cap table allocation just kind of floating out there with such a big stake can be a real problem. Let's talk about resolving disputes. When there are disputes among co-founders, what do you suggest? Let's say maybe before it gets to an attorney, but what do you see as the most effective ways to deal with some of those issues that come up?
I think mostly it's just communication, understanding each other's goals, understanding what's best for the business, and working together. It's cliche to say, but we talk about this as being a marriage, right? All the time. This is a very, very close relationship, and you're going to be dealing with each other for a very long time. And so usually most of these disputes are settled with relative ease, with some back and forth discussion and understanding. Both sides have to be flexible, but ultimately, it doesn't usually rise, especially in the early stages, to the level of malcontent where you can't actually work together. But it's important to face those head on.
I mean, I think that kind of communication, key to being a good business leader, especially important when it comes to some of these sometimes very tricky and hot button issues that can arise when there are disputes among leadership, whether they're co-founders or just part of your C-suite, etc. I want to get back to the 83B election because I know that that's really important, and also something I find that I think early stage, first-time founders especially, maybe go to Upwork, maybe go to LegalZoom, one of the a low-cost provider, set up a company and sort of barrel their way through the issues and don't know about filings and stock and just kind of want to get things done. Sure. I have done exactly that. So let's maybe talk about the low-cost providers and where they might come in handy, and then also some of these filings that are super important and why you really might want some more professionalized advice early.
Sure. Yeah, listen, I acknowledge that this is going to be a very self-serving statement, but you get what you pay for to some degree, and those form-generating services, while there is a place for them, they don't necessarily come with the advice and guidance of a law firm, right? Whether that's us or any other firm that's focused in representing early stage or emerging growth companies. That advice is really important. And it's not so much that the form is what is valuable in today's world, right? Because every form is available online for the world to see, right? So it's not so much in the form, it's in the advice and the guidance and the
how to fill it out
of what's market that adds value, and that's where a really good lawyer or law firm should come into play. So an 83B is a perfect example because this is one area of law that's extremely unforgiving. Mistakes made in the early stages can have really important negative implications long term. And so I'm going to grossly oversimplify more for my benefit because I'm not a tax lawyer. But an 83B election is essentially a filing that you file with the IRS that allows you to pay the tax on your restricted stock at the date of grant, as of the date of grant, rather than when the risk of forfeiture goes away. Because absent an 83B election, the IRS doesn't treat your stock as fully owned by you until the risk of forfeiture lapses. So you can see why that would be a problem for founders, right? When there's a 1-year cliff, and the vesting on 25% of your shares won't vest until that 1-year anniversary. Presumably and hopefully the shares are worth more than 0.00001 a year from now, and the IRS will tax you on that higher amount unless you file an 83B election. So, basically an 83B election is this game of let's pretend that just for tax purposes, I own these shares outright today with no risk of forfeiture. I pay the tax on those shares today. For founders at nominal value, it's a no-brainer decision. It's instead of paying the tax when the risk of forfeiture lapses. The rub with the 83B election is that there is a very finite window for filing. you only have 30 days from the date of grant to file your 83B election. And there is no good cure for failure to timely file. So it's important that when founders do take their shares pursuant to this vesting schedule or this risk of forfeiture, that they file an 83B election within 30 days.
Could have tremendous implications should there be, big upside, which is the whole point of doing, or
Exactly.
often a major reason to do these things.
Exactly.
When it comes to fundraising, what are some common issues you see come up in negotiations, and have things changed a bit? Because the market's very, very hot. There's a lot of capital around, so I'm curious if you've seen anything change over the last few years that maybe was market a few years ago, but is different today.
Yeah, I think to some degree, entrepreneurs and founders are getting some credit or more credit for time served than they might have historically. So sort of tying this back to vesting and making sure that the key employees are in it for the long haul. Investors.
And by the way, to that point, are you? I know that in some cases, investors could require that the vesting schedule restart at a, on
Exactly.
a fundraise. Are you seeing when you say credit for time served that they're able to continue with the schedule that they already set out, or they're saying, well, you've really been doing this for 6 months, we'll give you the 6 months, but not the 2 years?
So some combination of both, right? So if the vesting schedule is reasonable and there's still sufficient amount of equity that's tied to the vesting schedule, investors are often willing to accept the vesting schedule as is. Probably more often you'll see something like, you've been at this for 2 years, so let's say that 50% of your shares are vested up front, or as of the date of, or they're already vested as of the financing, and then the remainder will vest in monthly installments over 2 more years. So they're getting the credit for the time that they have helped to build this company to date. But again, investors want to make sure that the team is in it. And so they do, generally speaking, want some of the shares, a sufficient amount of the shares, to remain tied to vesting.
Yeah, makes sense. What are some of the other common issues, that come up, especially in the first funding round, that entrepreneurs should be aware of, that investors may require, that maybe you hear as surprise issues?
Yeah, I think entity type is one of them. Institutional investors like VCs, generally speaking, invest only in corporations rather than LLCs. So a lot of companies form as an LLC thinking that one, it might be cheaper and less transactional costs with forming an LLC. That may or may not be true. Or maybe incorporated pursuant to the laws of a state other than Delaware, which is where most investors will expect the portfolio companies that they invest in to be incorporated. Or the equity allocation may not be what the investor expects. I represent a really exciting holographic technology company where on formation, the equity allocation made sense, but it later turned out that the CTO, who was critical to this company, didn't have enough upside. And so at the time of the first institutional round, financing round, the investors basically said, love this business, love this company, but this guy's not incentivized enough. And so we'd like to see you reallocate the shares accordingly. And that's, again, harder to do later on when the shares have value. In that case, it worked out fine. But that is something that we see from time to time where, giving away too much equity to the team or to consultants who are not critical to the success of the company can come to bite a company in the long run.
What about the idea of putting together from day one a pool for employees? Do you think you seeing that companies are doing that? Is
Sure.
that what percentage do you think is the right allocation?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah.
So we generally, when we form a new company, when we do what we call our starter kit of documents, we always include an equity incentive plan. Those are shares that are allocated and reserved for issuances to employees and consultants and non-employee directors as incentives for working hard. You're an early stage company, cash is strapped, you're bootstrapping, you need to allocate resources, especially cash resources, as efficiently as possible. And so the primary way that these early stage companies incentivize employees and consultants is through equity. You should try to make sure that is, that you're giving a rational amount based on the services that will be contributed by each of those types of people. But yes, an equity incentive plan is very, very standard and common. We generally say roughly 15% on incorporation on a fully diluted basis should be reserved for an equity incentive plan.
Got it. Love it. This is super helpful. So many issues that come up that, I mean, many of these mistakes I have personally made. And so I'm glad that we're hopefully helping to educate some other founders in not walking down that same path, because they can be expensive mistakes and challenging mistakes. And so for people who want to learn more, they can check out McCarter.com, McCarter.com, if I spelled that right. I think I did.
You did.
And any other ways that people can get in touch with you, Jared?
Yeah, please. If you find yourself on McCarter.com, navigate your way to my profile. You'll see my email address, my phone number. For those who don't go to the website, it's just my name, first letter J, Jared, JSORIN at McCarter.com. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We love this work. We love working with early stage companies and the entrepreneurs and the innovators who are doing amazing things. So please do reach out if we can be helpful.
I appreciate that. And I should also highlight that I know that you can, when people are concerned about perhaps the perception of expensive fees, I know you can be flexible with plans to make it work for early stage companies. Or, you don't have to give your fee structure here, but for those who are concerned about, can I even afford this, reach out, because you might be surprised that you can, or there are ways that it can be structured to make it work there. Unless things have changed, Jared, I know you had some flexible options in the past, especially for early stage founders.
Absolutely. Right? Nothing has changed. We exist to serve early stage companies and emerging growth companies. We've structured our business as a law firm to bring down those transaction costs. And so yes, we are very, very happy to work on alternative fee structures and be as flexible as humanly possible.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. You guys have been big supporters for a long time, and so it means a lot to the TechUnited community. So we like to end with a high five. So on the count of three, give me the high five, your camera. 1, 2, 3. Boom. Good to see you. Right. Stay well. I hope to see you in person soon.
Same here.
And we'll talk soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.